All right, anatomy. Part two of our notes. We did it in class with a couple of our sections, but I wanted to make sure that other section had a video. And also, if you were out that day, I know a couple of you quarantined, things like that. I wanted you to make sure you had these videos. So let's fly through these. This is part two of our endocrine system notes. Remember last time we covered just basically what endocrine system was, hormones, and we really spent time on the pituitary gland. That's the master gland, the one that kind of controls a lot of other things. Today we're going to look at a few other glands, some that are pretty well known. Maybe some of the things to do with them aren't super well known, but hopefully after today you'll know about them. One's the thyroid. The thyroid is butterfly shaped or bow tie shaped. It's around the bottom behind or below, your larynx, in front of your trachea, at the very base of your neck. Sometimes you can kind of feel, don't push too hard. It is soft tissue, but you can kind of feel it. It produces hormones called thyroxine and this other big old word that I struggle with, which regulates metabolism. What is metabolism? It's one of those words that we talk about a whole lot but don't really understand. Metabolism is a series of processes. It's a whole lot of things going on that changes our nutrition, what we take in, the food that we eat, into usable energy. So metabolism is not as easy as saying, he got such a high metabolism, he can eat whatever he wants, so he never gains weight. Or she's got a real slow metabolism. She'll, put on 5 pounds looking at a piece of cake. We kind of make it simplified like that oftentimes in our common everyday life. But metabolism is very complex. It's very complex. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with it. And the thyroid hormone, among some other hormones, definitely plays a huge role in converting nutrition or nutrients into usable energy, right? The thyroid, a lot of times, isn't even thought of until something goes wrong. It's kind of like the long snapper in football. Nobody knows his name until he, puts one over the placeholder's head and we lose the Super Bowl, okay? The thyroid's kind of like that. And when it does mess up, or something goes wrong, as we're going to see, it can have some pretty dire consequences. Remember, we learned a little bit about hormone cascades through one of our videos, simply being that the pituitary gland sends some thyrotrophin, which is a hormone that causes the causes the thyroid to be stimulated. So then it will release some of its hormones. A couple disorders, like I said, you kind of understand it more or you see it and it becomes well known when things go wrong. Hyperthyroidism, remember hyper means too much or above the normal. Hyperthyroidism, this is when the thyroid hormones are being secreted excessively high. Amounts are excessively high. Now, not always, but sometimes this hyperthyroidism causes a goiter. People mistaken this sometimes for like a tumor inside the neck. You can kind of see in the pictures here. It's just kind of when the thyroid itself starts to get bigger, kind of protrudes out, and it becomes visibly seen. Now, not all people with hyperthyroidism has a goiter, but it is a telltale sign of, okay, there's something wrong with thyroid. Some symptoms that you might see is weight loss, nervousness, excessive sweating, increased heart rate, protruding eyes. And think about that. If our body is secreting a lot of hormones that's breaking down nutrients very, very quickly in excessive amounts, more than we probably need at the time, of course, it's going to cause our body to start ramping up, right? Our heart rate's going to start amping up a lot more. It's going to increase. Sweating, because what's happened from this breakdown of nutrients, there's heat released. So internal temperature has to regulate itself. So sweating is trying to cool that down. Also nervousness, feeling anxious, sometimes tapping the feet and things. Now, this is all stuff that happens when conditions are normal, not when you're getting scared or, running a mile, just sitting around. There is a disorder, an autoimmune disorder called Graves' disease. I believe in our first intro video, a lady named, I think it was Maria, had this disease. And he talked about it. If you hadn't watched that video, it's worth your time. But it's an autoimmune disorder. Anytime you hear autoimmune disorder, our immune system protects us from foreign invaders, right? A bacteria or a virus or whatever is getting in our system. It tries to kill it with these antibodies. An autoimmune disorder is when our body's immune system attacks something that's already inside our body, okay? In this case, it's Graves' disease. It's attacking the thyroid gland. And that thyroid gland becomes overactive. This can be treated with medications or also removing or destroying part of the thyroid through some surgery or some radiation. So not all hyperthyroidism, this is going back a slide, not all hyperthyroidism is caused by Graves' disease, but Graves' disease does cause hyperthyroidism. Okay, so that's the link between those two. On the other end, hypothyroidism. Hypo means below or under or less than. In this type of disease, the thyroid hormones are low. Okay, and look at the opposite. And we kind of see these symptoms is when the body's processes slow down. You may be fatigued, a slow heart rate. Weight gain is commonly associated with hypothyroidism. Now, hypothyroidism can come from several different types of disorders, diseases. My wife has hypothyroidism as a condition because she has something called Hashimoto's disease, which is fairly becoming more prevalent. We'll say that. That's the thing about thyroid disorders. I believe on one of our videos also said this. In a room of our class size, let's say there's 25 people in there, chances are great there are multiple people with a thyroid disorder. Now, some of them haven't been diagnosed, and a lot of times you want to wait till a few years after puberty for that to be diagnosed to rule it out. Okay, so it's not anything else. It's just hormonal changes. It is, what you have. Anyway, hypothyroidism. Thyroid is becoming more understood. A lot of times it's like the last thing we look at. Oh, they're, weight gain and they're slow heartbeat and feeling lethargic and all this kind of stuff. We'll rule out 10 other things before we go, okay, it's hypothyroidism caused by whatever. The parathyroid glands, there's 4 of them. They're on the surface of the thyroid. These release the aptly named parathyroid hormone, which regulates the level of calcium in the bloodstream. That's basically their biggest job. Make sure our calcium levels are correct. If they get a little too low, they'll release some hormones that stimulate calcium production, breakdown from the nutrients in our food, metabolism-wise. Or if there's too much, it will also break down calcium before it can enter into cells. So parathyroid hormone. Don't worry about negative feedback. I know you got a blank there, but I'm not going to ask you questions about it. One that you're probably very familiar with is the adrenal glands. These adrenal glands, there's 2 of them. There's one on each kidney right on top of it. You see in the chart there. There's 2 parts, just like there's 2 parts to the kidneys. If you remember back in the urinary system, the kidneys have the cortex and the medulla. The adrenal glands also have the cortex. The outer region, the part like a shell, is the adrenal cortex. The innermost parts are the medulla of the adrenal glands. And remember when we learned in that video about hormone cascades, they work interactively with the pituitary and the hypothalamus, which we'll cover in part 3 of our notes. All right, so the adrenal medulla, it secretes the hormone that we probably are very aware of called adrenaline. That's what we call it, day-to-day life, adrenaline. The actual name is epinephrine. It produces this epinephrine, also another hormone called norepinephrine. Okay, epinephrine, you've probably heard of an EpiPen. It's a tool, a medical tool that people use to get a shot of epinephrine if they are exposed to something they're allergic to. Okay, but it is adrenaline. It's artificially created adrenaline. All right. So think about what adrenaline does. It increases the heart rate, makes your muscles and brain get more blood flow, causing them to become more efficient. You may have that focus, intense focus. It can also cause the relaxation of smooth muscles. Now, why is that important? If I'm having to go into a situation where I have adrenaline pumping, let's say I'm up to bat, 9th inning, 2 outs, bases loaded, all that good stuff. I'm going to be pumped, right? I'm going to be focused. I'm going to be tuned in on if he's throwing a fastball or a changeup or whatever. But I'm also the smooth muscles in my digestive system are going to kind of shut down a little bit because I don't need to be worried about going to poop, right? I don't need to be worrying about, digesting my lunch at that time. I am using my muscles and my brain to hopefully win the game. Adrenaline also helps with the conversion of glycogen to glucose, as we'll look at that in part 3 a little closer. Glucose is the sugar in our blood. It's basically the sugars that all our cells are going to use, the sugars that come from the breakdown of carbohydrates and the eventual breakdown of proteins that we ingest. I like to think about epinephrine in what about a fight or flight situation that we've talked about. We looked at this with the brain. Somebody jumps out from behind a corner at you, you're either going to punch them in the face or run away most likely, right? And that's because your body goes through this adrenaline rush or this epinephrine rush immediately without really a conscious effort. And that's because your pituitary senses, okay, there's something going on that stimulated the body very quickly. It sends a quick hormonal signal down to the hypothalamus, which sends a super quick hormonal signal to the adrenal glands, which then they produce epinephrine, okay? And that goes through your bloodstream because it's ductless glands, right into the bloodstream, right to all these muscles, into your brain. I mean, in the fraction of seconds here, this happens, right? And then you fight or flight. You get that initial rush. The adrenal cortex is the outside of the adrenal glands. There's 30 different steroids, including several different hormones that this part of the adrenal glands secrete. Some of them include aldosterone. This basically, it causes the kidneys to conserve sodium ions and excrete potassium ions. It helps the kidneys regulate your sodium and potassium levels. And not a big deal on a day-to-day basis because typically our body does really good at making sure we have the right amount of sodium and potassium. But what happens if you've ever played like a sport, if your sodium levels get low or your potassium levels get low, you start to feel a little faint. And that's why a lot of teams will have things like pickle juice, which is high in sodium, or bananas, which is high in potassium for somebody. If their levels get out of whack, the aldosterone's trying its best, but your physical exertions caused you not to be able to maintain the normal levels. You got to have something real quick to get a kind of a boost. So aldosterone does that, which every day it goes on and we don't realize it. Cortisol helps break down carbohydrates, proteins, glucose, and fat. Makes it break down and the absorption into cells. That's the metabolism. Guys, that's basically everything we eat. Okay, so cortisol is very important for that. It also helps maintain levels of glucose in the bloodstream during meals. Cortisol is what kicks in all the time, really, but what kicks in after that fight or flight adrenaline rush. Most adrenaline rushes only last 30 seconds to a minute tops. What happens after that? If somebody jumps out with a knife, is going to stab you, you get this initial fight or flight right away, but then the adrenaline starts to wear off. Are you just going to get stabbed in the face, or are you going to be able to fight them off? And that's what cortisol does. If you've ever ran a long distance, I always like telling my runners, hey, don't start out too fast on a mile race because your adrenaline's pumping, you're excited to be there, you want to get in the front and all this kind of stuff, but then what happens when it wears off? You have to back up and rely on your training. And we can kind of help the cortisol release from the adrenal medullas through aerobic exercise. So that's what helps us maintain this metabolism that's going on to give us energy throughout a long distance run. A couple diseases we're going to finish up with, and my time's almost up. Addison disease. This is hyposecretion of cortical hormones or cortisol, low amounts. Okay, so what it leaves us with is low blood sodium, increased potassium, and this can actually be fatal if these electrolytes are, not fixed. Okay, so Addison's disease, and then Cushing's syndrome. This is hypersecretion, so too much. And what it leaves us with, this chart does a good job of showing it. What it leaves us with is too much sodium. Okay, and too much sodium makes fluids retain inside of our body. It can leave you with puffy skin. The model here on the left is showing, got striations from skin stretching, stretch marks there because fluids have been building up, causing that skin to become puffy over time. So that's what Cushing syndrome can do. It stores up sodium, which stores up fluid, which makes everything start to kind of stretch out. Okay, so we see the thyroid, the parathyroid, and the adrenal glands are super important, and we really see their importance when things go wrong.